Well, hello YouTube, it's me, Fortmaster, and welcome to a new JaruJaruJ reaction. And, well, this is why I believe in third entity theory. So, I can't help but think that this is a response to the general, response that Jaru's last theory got, Azrael's Dust 2.0. And I will admit, I did dread, I did dread watching the previous video, because again, just with everything that appeared in Deltarune up to this point, like, it's very much, it seems very much so that, the player is, a part of the story. Again, like, going to the weird route, there's that one part where when you get to the part where Susie switches your controllers and she tells Chris, hey, stop making me do that, Rousey ominously looks back towards you saying, controls making you, or something like that. So there are characters in the story that know we're here, and Jaru's just insistence on ignoring that is honestly more than a little abrasive. That being said, again, I have loved Jaru's theories in the past, so I'm definitely doing my best to go into this video with an open mind just to see what they have to say. But yeah, the whole weight behind that, with everything that has been happening, I honestly don't know what to think. So let's actually just get into this and see what the video is actually going to be about then. So yeah, of course, as always, original videos linked in the description if you haven't seen it yet for some reason. Corner video will lead to my Let's Play of the day. And if you like this video or any other video that I make, I'd very much appreciate it if you gave the video a like and subscribe to my channel, because most of the people that watch my videos aren't subscribed, and I'd very much like that to change, because my next big goal is to hopefully hit 10,000 subscribers. And if you want to support me but don't feel confident about becoming a YouTube or Patreon member, feel free to use the Super Thanks option underneath all of my videos. But yeah, with all that out of the way, let's get this thing started then, shall we?
Hello, my name is Jaru, and today I am talking about Deltarune. Or to be more precise, I will be explaining why I am a proponent of third entity theory. I've struggled to communicate clearly on this front in the past because discussions about this theory often spiral into my more elaborate ideas, or into debates about meta-narrative in video games. So to avoid those traps, I am going to keep this discussion as grounded as possible. No Azrael's Dust, no Oberon's Smog, no deep dives into what a meta-narrative is, just the core facts and why they lead me where they do. First, definitions. In Deltarune, Chris is possessed by the Red Soul. Within the theory community, there are two major interpretations regarding the nature of this possession, and these two schools of thought are colloquially referred to as player soul theory and third entity theory. Player soul theory argues that the only entity involved in Chris's possession is the player. The soul is not a separate character, it is our diegetic avatar. It is not literally our soul, but rather an in-world representation of our presence. It's worth noting that there are many variations of this theory, as even staunch proponents of player soul theory still disagree about various details, such as where the soul came from, how it relates to Chris, whether it's artificial, stolen, etc. But those details are not too important for the purposes of today's discussion.
God, yeah, this goes back and reminds me of I think it was one of the videos I did a reaction to of Andrew Cunningham's video. What were they? I can't remember which one it was specifically, but he was going through the list and all the different possibilities of which who was what and stuff like that. Again, Again, I'm a proponent of player soul. The question of, is this Chris's natural soul that we've kind of like taken like control of? Is it an artificial thing that either like it's been kind of like grafted into Chris, and that's why they seem weak when the soul's removed from them? Like, so those major questions definitely are still, well, they still need to be answered.
What does matter is this. A major appeal of player soul theory is its meta angle. Specifically, the idea that Deltarune explores what happens when the player and the protagonist are at odds. Through this lens, the game becomes about control itself, about the ethics of puppeteering a character. This is compelling and understandably popular, but this focus on preserving a pure player-Chris dynamic often leads to resistance towards anything that complicates that relationship, including third entity theory. Third entity theory proposes that there is another entity inside the soul separate from both the player and Chris, hence the name third entity. Once again, there are many variants of this theory, but the version I support argues that the player does not control Chris directly. We instead control this mysterious entity within the soul who, in turn, controls Chris. The specifics of that entity are open to interpretation, but the key distinction of third entity theory is that the soul is not viewed as a simple representation of the player. So, this is the gist of player soul theory and third entity theory. I do need to emphasize that I am simplifying these theories for the sake of making this explanation brief. In reality, the theory crafting community is quite diverse, and we all have our own interpretations of how these theories are implemented. This one-sentence definition is a general overview, and is not representative of every single variation of these theories. With that groundwork laid, I am ready to explain why I favor third entity theory and showcase the evidence that led me to this conclusion. I'll be dividing this evidence into three categories: direct textual evidence, narrative structure, and authorial patterns. Let's start with the strongest category, direct textual evidence. A major reason I adopted third entity theory is the extensive evidence that Chris has been possessed since before the game begins. First of this evidence is this birdcage in Chris's room. It is described as having seen many crashes, and there is a suspicious bloodstain nearby. And by the end of Chapter 1, we understand why. When Chris wishes to regain control of their body, they violently remove their soul and throw it into this cage. The implication is clear. The birdcage was already being used to contain the soul before Chapter 1. The many crashes comment combined with the bloodstains suggests this is not a first-time event. And since the only known reason Chris has for removing the soul is to regain control of their body, that heavily implies they've been dealing with this possession for a while, long before the player ever got involved. This, of course, is a problem for player soul theory, because Chris obviously couldn't be possessed by the player before the beginning of the game. The player cannot be the origin of a dynamic that is already ongoing, which leads to a necessary conclusion. If the soul has been constraining Chris since before the game begins, then something other than the player must have been involved, a third entity, and it has likely been there for some time. Chris's behavior reinforces this conclusion. When the game begins and they are clearly being puppeteered, they don't panic, they don't seek help, and they don't confront us. Instead, they behave like someone accustomed to this situation. More than that, they behave like someone who has developed a full-blown routine for managing this condition. Chris even demonstrates awareness of a technique for removing their own soul, which not only grants them full control of their body, but also somehow doesn't kill them. And I'm not even talking about the way they can survive without a soul. I'm talking about the way they graphically impale their own chest and just walk it off.
Okay, I mean, granted, still very early into the video here, But, like, I can definitely see where, they're coming from with this. Because, I mean, like, what is it? Like, Noelle herself literally does say, like, have you noticed that, like, Chris is acting really weird the last couple of days, i.e. what's happening in the game. But at the same time, just the idea of Chris, like, the soul being a third entity, is just, why would Chris specifically be, like, soulless when we see that, like, again, like, the whole idea is that you can't take stuff you heard in Undertale to Deltarune, like, one-to-one. Again, the whole thing, like, starting, like, monsters bleeding and all that sort of stuff, like, there's a number of things where you can't do it perfectly. But it is assumed that, monster souls and souls just in general are still a thing that exists. So, why would Chris specifically not have a soul? Now, yes, again, the whole idea that, the idea that the cage has been there for at least a little while is, it's obviously valid, but at the same time, I mean, it can't have been there for too long, because for one, the blood on the carpet is still red. I mean, granted, I've only had to clean up blood, most often my own blood, like, a few times in my life. But from what I do know for myself, from, like, personal experience, and from, like, experience from my dad has told me, because he used to be a firefighter, so there were a few times he would have to deal with blood. It's the fact that as blood ages, it turns black. And while the blood on the carpet is slightly darker, it's still very much red, so it has to have happened, relatively recently. And again, there is something to be said that, I guess you could call it almost like a hybrid of the two, but, like, there is something that could be said where there's the whole idea that, the player controlling Chris and the player in game or in universe are slightly different. Because the whole thing is, like, we've seen it multiple times throughout the game, is that, while we do control Chris throughout the game, when we tell Chris to do something through, like, a prompt or, like, through an option or something like that, Chris very much has, a limited amount of control to do things their own way. And even before then, it was always, like, Chris has always been very quiet, very out of the way, doesn't talk much. So they might have been being controlled for a while, but we, the player, are only start actively controlling them in the game when the game itself actually begins, when they have been controlled by the quote-unquote player for at least a little while. Again, there's the whole thing of device theory as well, that, they've been kind of, something with them's been going on for a while, yeah.
Real humans are not physically strong enough to thrust their own hand through their ribcage and into their chest cavity. That is not physically possible.
That being said, I do remember seeing a rather old piece of fan art where it's kind of like Chris pulled up their shirt and the heart and the soul was just kind of embedded in the front of their chest. It was very weird and graphic looking. God, I hope that's not what it's like in the universe.
The fact that Chris can do this and not only survive, but also instantly heal from having their chest excavated, all seems to suggest that Chris is much more than a regular human controlled by a player. Even if you argue that this is all metaphysical and that Chris isn't literally impaling themselves, the fact that they even know they can do something like this suggests they have been possessed for a while and have had time to prepare and practice this technique.
That being said, from everything we've seen in chapters 3 and 4, specifically with Carol and how the night works around them, again, it's very much the case that, Chris, we as the player are working against Chris because Chris is technically working with the bad guys. If, if Carol is in fact working with the knight, or is the knight, or however you want to work, however it actually works out. So there is the possibility that they've been literally just taught or to do how to do this.
Notably, the evidence I've discussed thus far is just what we are given in Chapter 1, and it's already more than enough to support the idea of a pre-existing possession. Once we get to Chapter 2 and beyond, the pile of evidence only grows larger. During the weird route, when Chris speaks to Noelle without the soul, she says it's the first time she's heard Chris's real voice in a long time. This seems to be referring to how Chris's voice, when they are possessed, sounds like it's coming from a speaker. Noelle saying that she hasn't heard this original voice in a long time, despite the player only being present for the previous 2 days, implies the possession predates our involvement. Dialogue from Susie backs this up. Susie describes Chris's weird speaker voice as being their normal voice, implying that Susie has only known Chris since after they became possessed. But we know from Noelle's blog that Chris and Susie interacted before the game began, including a pivotal confrontation where Chris said something to Susie that was so impactful that it sent her running away. Furthermore, Noelle mentions that this is just the latest in a series of interactions between Susie and Chris, with her bullying them for some time. That means Chris may very well have spoken to Susie several times in previous encounters, and if Chris has only just now become possessed by the player, then Susie should remember a different voice, but she doesn't.
I mean, that being said, again, there's several different ways you can look at this. And like, for me, again, going back to the whole thing that Chris is very much, very reserved, very kind of like, stereotypical depressed teenager sitting at the back of class, not really interacting with anybody. All with that whole thing with Noelle in the classroom when, Susie was bullying Chris, like, Noelle doesn't hear what Chris said. So, it's in all likelihood pretty much certain that Chris was whispering because, they were so close to Susie because, Susie was like just up in their face. And I don't know about you, but like your voice doesn't quite sound the same when you're whispering versus when you're talking normally. Like, I mean, just for me as example, like I honestly cannot. I've never bothered to keep track, but the amount of times in my life I've been told to like lower my voice because I naturally speak rather loud. Like, as I said before, like I actually have to turn down my audio track volume when I'm editing these videos, that just by like a single or by like 1 or 2 decibels, because there are certain times where like I'll near like the peak and the audio quality starts going weird. Like even like, God, wait, if I can just pull up my stuff here. Give me a second for my microphone. Like, okay, we got the whatever this software is, I'm forgetting, but if I go, hopefully this doesn't mess up my recording here, but if I go down to like my audio, my input gain, it's at 7, and even then I'm almost maxing out the bar here. So like people can describe Chris's quote unquote normal speaking voice as sounding like from a speaker, but when somebody whispers, they sound different because they're actively trying not to be as loud.
This implies that in all her previous interactions with Chris, they still had this possessed speaker voice that she mentioned. And if the weird speaker voice predates our arrival, then so does the possession. With that said, there is one counterpoint I'd like to address. In the normal route of Chapter 4, Noelle describes Chris's current voice as how they've sounded recently. Now, if you interpret recently to mean specifically in the last 2 days, then that could imply the possession began with the arrival of the player. However, that requires a very specific reading of this line, and it conflicts with the birdcage, the bloodstain, Chris's behavior, the blog post, Susie's description of Chris, and Noelle's own description from the weird route.
Oh my god, I just realized they specifically said on that the whole thing sounding like a speaker was during the weird route. The weird route specifically. And there was quite literally a whole bit in the weird route where, like, when you're talking with Noelle, like specifically in chapter 4, when you're at her house, where like it's like Chris is saying, don't say anything, they'll hear you. And then when Noelle asks, like, who's listening, it's like you, the player, quote unquote, say, I will. And it can almost be said that, oh, that's what it sounds like. Again, weird route. Yeah. Sorry, it was a very sudden thing that might have not come out the most clearly.
As such, I think this recently line was meant to be a vague explanation of one of Noelle's earlier lines in this chapter. Specifically, upon inspecting Carol's heart-shaped pillows, Noelle mentions how Chris used to pretend to rip out their heart and chase her around when they were kids. If taken literally, this could imply Chris has been possessed for a decade or more. But thanks to this recently line, we know that isn't the case. As such, rather than implying Chris only became possessed in the last 2 days, I suspect this line was simply meant to clarify that the possession began at some point between their early childhood and the present day. Regardless of how you read this line, the evidence in favor of a long-term possession still thoroughly outweighs the evidence to the contrary. In fact, going back to chapter 2, Toriel herself has a line suggesting that this possession isn't new. When Chris goes to wash their hands, remove their soul, and sneak out the window, Toriel remarks that this is just something they do. Toriel obviously doesn't know why Chris spends so long in the bathroom, but she is clearly suspicious of it. And if Chris has done this exact thing before, and yet this is the first time it's happened since the player arrived, that implies there were prior instances of Chris ditching the soul in the bathroom while they snuck outside.
Okay. As I said, I'm trying really hard here to give you the benefit of the doubt here, Jaru, but with this specifically, this is a really, really weak piece of evidence. Because, like, again, from Toriel's perspective, she says that Chris does this option, i.e. locking themselves in the bathroom and leaving the faucets running for a while. Chris ripping out their soul, like we see in the game, is only one of many different reasons they could be doing this. Because, well, I mean, for literally, like, the first thing that came to my mind was, I mean, you have to remember, at the end of the day, Chris is a teenager. And I think we've all done it at some point.
Can a guy get some privacy?
So, but, you know, ignoring that and more quote-unquote normal teenage habits, there is a possibility that, again, Chris is, at this point, we know Chris is either working with the Knight or Carol or both, depending on how the string board connections actually do end up working out in future chapters. For a while, like Chris has kept us, Chris has, kept secrets, has kept promises. No other, this is to help Carol somehow bring back Des, or helping Des who is the Knight, or helping the Knight, or, whatever. Like, we know, this instance here, Chris is going out the window to slash, Toriel's tires so Susie can't leave. Because Chris wants to create the Dark Fountain later to create the Dark World, and, then, Chapter 3 happens. But, again, there is, the very real possibility that, Chris has left the bathroom doing this whole thing, many times in the past, to, probably leave the house without Toriel knowing so that they can meet up with whoever the Knight is, or meet up with Carol in secret, or, do all this sort of stuff. There are more actors in this play than, just... Chris.
This further suggests that Chris's possession is not a new state of affairs for this household. Outside of the evidence implying that the possession has been going on for a while, there's also the evidence surrounding the soul's characterization. Notably, if player soul theory were true, then the soul shouldn't have any characterization beyond what attributes we choose to give it. And yet, chapters 3 and 4 repeatedly emphasize the musical skill difference between Chris and the soul. Chris can play piano, the soul cannot. This was hinted at in chapter 1 and is explicitly confirmed in chapter 4 with this piano melody that the soul cannot perform, but Chris can.
Okay. I don't think that's so much the case of the soul being incapable of playing the music, as it's more the case of Chris not letting us. Because again, going back to this scene, in the Sanctuary Dark Worlds, even if you play through every single one of those notes that you're given perfectly, the last one is always wrong. Because again, this is one of those options where you do something and then Chris is kind of given, a little bit of free reign to do something that you quote unquote told them to do. They just go burnt because they don't want to play, because you're the one telling them to play and they don't want to play for you.
This moment is then repeatedly called back to, further emphasizing its importance. Meanwhile, under our control, Chris can play the guitar masterfully in Chapter 3, despite having no known experience. This creates a consistent distinction. Chris excels at piano, while the soul excels at guitar. This is not neutral characterization. This is extremely specific, and under player soul theory, this becomes incredibly awkward to explain.
I mean, again, not really. I mean, this is kind of going into device theory territory, but, if the soul is, the player as it is, our ability to interact with, the world is very much limited by, our controls. At the end of the day, for 90% of the time when we interact with the world of Deltarune, we're limited to, the WASD keys and, enter, or whatever other button you have, as your interaction button. It's only when we're given other options like this where we have, the Guitar Hero controls that, we can play the guitar masterfully because we've been actually given the tools to do it properly. I mean, just going to actual Guitar Hero. I mean, what is it? It's one little flapper switch and 5 buttons up here. I think we have Guitar Hero 3 somewhere in the basement. I remember playing that a lot when I was a little kid, but just because I play Guitar Hero doesn't mean I play the actual guitar.
As Deltarune players vary wildly in musical ability. Suggesting that all players are bad at piano but good at guitar is completely nonsensical.
But all players are good at pushing the appropriate buttons, or at least they should be. Don't look back at my playthrough.
By contrast, under third entity theory, this makes perfect sense. The soul is its own character with specific strengths and weaknesses. It being good at guitar and bad at piano is totally acceptable characterization. The same applies to flirting. In Chapter 4, Susie brings specific attention to how good Chris is at flirting, and Noelle's reaction indicates how completely out of character this is. Flirting is explicitly being framed as abnormal for Chris, suggesting that their ability to flirt with enemies so effectively that they surrender is a talent originating from the soul.
But following by your own logic, if the soul being its separate entity has been possessing Chris for a while, that would mean that Chris was capable of flirting so well for a while. The whole flirting thing, besides also just being a reference to, the constant flirting and stuff like that in, Undertale, is very much something that only comes up, and it's only really been a thing since we come in, we ourselves, get into the driver's seat, so to speak.
Again, that's fine if a third entity is involved, but if the soul equals the player, then the game would be assuming that all players are charismatic flirts, which is obviously an untenable position.
But again, there's the whole thing of that you're not referring. Again, it's the whole thing that you're not even. I'm sorry, just give me a second. The one thing that is kind of annoying me a little bit about this, and again, we're not even halfway through the video, so maybe Jaru will bring it up, but it's the whole fact that with the whole thing with the soul being the player, like with the soul being the player, again, as I said before, our like options to actually interact with the world are like limited. Like, it's not like we're stepping into like a VR headset and like able to like manipulate Chris's limbs one-to-one. Like, as it said, like the people in the world notice how weird Chris is, where they can just stand perfectly still for no discernible reason, while we, the player, do something completely out of in the real world. We have control of Chris's body, but it's not perfect control. We can only do so much as though we are given the option to do in the first place.
Individually, each of these pieces of evidence could be explained away, but collectively, they form a consistent pattern. Chris appears to have been possessed since before the player arrived, and the possessing entity displays distinct characterization separate from Chris and separate from the player. Moving on from the direct textual evidence, we can now discuss the second category, narrative structure. Player soul theory often claims that the central conflict of Deltarune, or at least one of the central conflicts, is that of the player versus the protagonist. This is seen as a fascinating exploration of the way we engage with player characters in video games. However, this raises an important question. Does this interpretation gel with Deltarune's core theme? And in order to answer that question, we must first define what Deltarune's core theme even is. In other words, what is Deltarune actually about? This is, of course, open to interpretation, but to me, the clearest through line across everything we've seen so far is the theme of constrained freedom. I believe that Deltarune wishes to explore what happens when freedom is restricted, shared, or weaponized, and what kinds of philosophies, worldviews, and emotions emerge under those conditions. And if Deltarune is fundamentally about constrained freedom, then the nature of Chris and the soul's relationship is very important. Player soul theorists interpret the game as being primarily about the player controlling Chris. In that model, Chris is a victim, and the player is an external, godlike force imposing their will. Now, to be fair, that interpretation does explore a form of constrained freedom, but it is specifically exploring oppression, aka one-sided domination. And I don't think that is the thematic lane that the game is primarily operating in, because Deltarune doesn't just explore control, it explores systems of control. It explores how people behave when they're trapped inside constraints that they didn't choose. Here are some examples. Noelle is so restrained by the expectations of her friends and family that she almost never does what she wants to do. She didn't choose to be born into this family or this society, yet they restrain her nonetheless. Birdley is so thoroughly bound by expectations to be the smart kid that it corrupts his friendship with Noelle, resulting in him using her for his own ends. It also limits his ability to make new friends due to the pseudo-intellectual persona he has adopted, while simultaneously leaving his entire sense of identity so fragile that Susie can shatter him with a few cutting remarks. Society hoisted the role of smart kid onto Birdley, and that constraint has devastated him. And Susie is trapped in a similar boat. Society has labeled her as a brute and a bully, someone whose nature is steeped in violence and cruelty. That label causes her her to adopt this violent persona as a defense mechanism, even though all she really wants is for someone to believe in her. This label is so internalized at this point that it takes quite a bit of work from the old man to convince Susie that it's okay to believe that she can be something other than a brute, someone who heals and loves rather than hurting and scaring. And then there are the Darkners, who are entirely bound by their purpose of being servants for the Lightners. And this predefined role has caused every major Darkner antagonist to have a full-blown mental breakdown, with the king getting abandoned by the Lightners caused his heart to crack with hatred, leading to him becoming a tyrant who oppresses his people and even his own son. This oppression causes Lancer to feel obligated to be a bad guy, which causes him to betray Susie when he feels torn between his loyalty to his father and his loyalty to her. The Queen was so obsessed with fulfilling her role that the moment the internet went down and she felt like she wasn't adequately serving her purpose, she became a controlling tyrant who ended up hurting not only her own people, but even Noelle, despite Noelle being the very person that Queen most wanted to help. And then there's Tenna, who is so psychologically ruined by his inability to continue entertaining the Lightners that he not only became a hated tyrant, much like King and Queen before him, but he also ends up hurting and ultimately alienating his two closest friends, Mike and Spamton, the two most important people in his life, and Tenna lost them out of a desperate desire to stay relevant and interesting for the Lightners.
Okay, wait a second. I was very much on board with that whole thing with, with Tenna, losing Mike. How did Tenna's, want to stay relevant and stuff like that make him lose Spamton? Like, it's very much assumed at this point that by basically everybody that I've heard, that Spamton, left, because of the whole thing where him, losing the, whoever was on the phone with him, Gaster, quote unquote. But, after, Spamton lost the contact, that's when he started going nuts, everything started going bad for him, and he left. Like, where was it said that Tenna was the one that pushed Spamton away?
In all three of these cases, the larger system of Darkners serving Lightners causes such suffering for these rulers that it resulted in them recreating the same oppression that they were victims of. Their tyrannical rule is a mirror of the larger system that has them ensnared. They are forced to serve Lightners, their subjects are forced to serve them, and everyone is left diminished and unhappy.
I mean, you can say that, but at the same time, like, you can't help, like, yeah, you're partially right in that, a lot of everything that was going wrong is because of the rulers, but at the same time, you're kind of forgetting a key player in that all three of these rulers have, in the reason why they started being so tyrannical, and that was the Knight. It's only when the Knight appears that, King starts becoming really bad and starts, working with the Knight, to flex their schemes. Same with, Queen. Though with Queen, it wasn't so direct. She saw the Knight create the fountain in the library, and, like, being inspired, again, partially correct by that whole thing, like, losing the internet kind of made her want to fulfill her purpose. She decided that, with how stressed out the Lightners are, I'll just cast the entire world in darkness so that I can conquer and not just conquer, but also, help and calm them. And again, Tenna, that whole scheme was the whole thing that happened with, with Chapter 3, why Tenna became so tyrannical is because of Chris and the Knight, because of the whole scheme and stuff like that.
This system of darkners serving lightners is utterly toxic for all parties involved, and yet neither side chose this path. It is a system that they were born into. 𝐓𝐢𝐈 is an outlier among rulers in that he didn't become a tyrant, but that doesn't mean he survived the system unscathed. His entire sense of identity is so tied up with being a tool for Chris and Susie that he refuses to self-actualize himself, and he even emotionally punishes himself whenever he feels a desire to be more than just a servant. The fact that 𝐓𝐢𝐈 had no subjects to rule over could be implying that since he could not derive a sense of agency by taking freedom from others the way King, Queen, and Tenna did, 𝐓𝐢𝐈 instead turned his pain inwards, causing him to oppress himself rather than oppressing others, which then brings us to the system that embodies constrained freedom more than anything else in this entire game.
I mean, again, it's with the whole thing with darkness and stuff like that, it is more than a little tricky, because the whole thing with darkness is, I mean, as 𝐓𝐢𝐈 points out, in chapter 3, darkners don't technically actually exist. They are like inanimate objects in the real world that are given life through the power of the dark fountains. If you remove the dark fountains, they go back to being just regular inanimate objects, with their own personal histories kind of being extrapolated from their history of use in the real world, in the light world. So, the whole thing, 𝐓𝐢𝐈 says that darkner's purpose is to, help, lightners and stuff like that, because in actuality, in their normal everyday form, they are literally just inanimate objects, literal tools, to be used by lightners to, to help. I mean, again, as I said, as Jaru said themselves, the whole, specifically, really specifically with King and Tenna specifically, a lot of their anguish and stress is the fact that they're not being used to help. It's not the fact that they're being used that caused them to become tyrannical. It's the fact that they're not being used that caused them to become tyrannical. And the fact that they felt like they were being abandoned.
The prophecy. An unbending, unchanging set of words that dictates your role long before you are even born. It can't be argued with, it can't be reasoned with, it is a force of nature. It is a system that has constrained literally everyone, and not only has this completely warped and damaged the way 𝐓𝐢𝐈 interacts with the world and with his friends, but it is also likely what's responsible for driving 𝐓𝐢𝐈 and Spamton insane. Even if it wasn't specifically the prophecy that did this, something made them feel like their freedom had been compromised, and the results are clear. 𝐓𝐢𝐈 saw his freedom was constrained and decided that true freedom came from nihilism. You don't care that you are a slave if you don't care about anything. He still wants some entertainment, however, so he torments those who encounter him, perpetuating the cycle of violence and oppression. Spamton similarly saw that his freedom was constrained and obsessed over acquiring enough power that he could transcend his destiny. Much like 𝐓𝐢𝐈, this made him violently unhinged, causing him to bring suffering to everyone he encounters. And notably, with both 𝐓𝐢𝐈 and Spamton, the consequences of constrained freedom were quite dire. 𝐓𝐢𝐈 was imprisoned and lost his only real friend, while Spamton lost everything and ultimately betrayed the one person in the world who understood what he was going through. Over and over again, Deltarune explores what happens when people are denied freedom by the systems imposed upon them. It isn't merely about domination or oppression. Yes, there are tyrants, but those rulers are framed less as the root problem and more as symptoms of a deeper structure, a world where darkners are bound to serve lightners. These rulers are corrupted not by the fact that they have power, but by their desperation to reclaim agency within a system designed to take agency away.
God, again, I mean, just go back to my whole previous statement about darkners, not technically being real. I mean, again, it just, thinking back, I mean, that is kind of one of the things that was specifically kind of set up in Chapter 3. I mean, you know, Rousey goes on that whole speech about, you know, them not being real, and that'd probably be best for Chris and Susie to make, like, actual friends in the real world. And, you know, it's very much the possibility that at some point Susie is going to have to come to terms with that, you know, with that fact. I mean, she herself, when she's fighting, you know, Gerson, the old man, that she wants this story to go on forever. She doesn't want it to end. But that's just the thing. This is a story, and there is going to be an ending. It has to end at some point. The problem, like, one of the, like, there is, like, talking about symbolism, like, one of the other major one of the major themes that's kind of, like, been constantly symbolized throughout the game is just, you know, escapism and stuff like that. And it's just the whole thing where you can't keep running into escapism. It's that whole thing where it's like, if there are too many the dark worlds are like the perfect encapsulation of escapism. Literally going to another world, having like friends and like beings made of everyday objects that you can go on adventures with and just ignore real world problems with. But as soon as when you start having too many of those worlds, too many dark fountains, that's when the world starts to crumble. The roaring. The apocalypse happens when you don't face real life. And I obviously feel very sorry for Rousey having that kind of existential dread on you at all time. But it's something that unfortunately can't be ignored.
That framing suggests the game isn't primarily interested in powerful individuals oppressing the vulnerable. Instead, it examines how people who are themselves constrained turn on one another, seeking control when they feel trapped by larger systems they cannot escape. Even the Angel, the most powerful being in this setting, is constrained by the prophecy. They will be banished. That outcome is fixed. And by showing that even the highest authority, the god of this world, is still bound, the story makes it clear that the buck doesn't stop with whoever holds the most power. It stops with the system itself. In other words, this isn't a story about which constrained individual is stronger. It's a story about the cage that entraps them all. Which brings us back to Chris and the soul. This possession is not framed as a god puppeteering a helpless human. It is depicted as two entities forced to share one body, an unpleasant arrangement for both parties involved. We control Chris extensively, yes, but Chris can eject us and lock us in a birdcage. Neither side has full autonomy. Neither side communicates, nor do they cooperate. They just struggle for control. This is a story of mutual constraint, a toxic coexistence that neither chose, a shared cage. But that interpretation only functions if the soul and Chris are equally constrained. If Chris is controlled directly by the player, an entity from outside this fictional world, then their dynamic becomes metaphysically lopsided. The player is omniscient, can reset timelines, and exists beyond this world's constraints. That turns this conflict between Chris and the soul into a grand cosmic power struggle between God and man, which doesn't exactly reflect the grounded, character-driven exploration of constrained freedom that we see everywhere else in Deltarune.
But again, that whole thing, it's kind of like, are we God? We're not really, is the thing. As I said, going back to the whole, as I've said multiple times in this reaction, like, our ability to manipulate and do things in the world is very much constrained by both, you know, the options we're given through our controls and just by Chris themselves. Our control of them is imperfect.
Under this player soul model, the system constraining Chris is exclusive to them. The player is only constrained insofar as we choose to be, which undermines the idea of a system that stands above everyone. Even the rules created by Toby Fox when coding this game are not hard limits, as we could choose to rewrite this world into something more appealing if we so desired. We could even choose to not interact with this world at all, which bucks all of Toby Fox's rules entirely. However, if the soul is its own character, trapped, limited, and unhappy in this relationship, then this dynamic mirrors every other relationship in the game. Two beings with partial agency, constrained by circumstance, and coping poorly by asserting control over one another.
You know, it's the whole thing I'm wondering here. Because, like, I was just thinking about it now, and that I don't think I can ever remember Jaru saying anything about Gaster ever. And again, while the consensus on Gaster continually shifts as, new thoughts and stuff come out about whether he's actually going to appear or stuff like that, you cannot ignore the fact that there have been several points in the game where Gaster has been talking to us. So the whole idea, again, the prophecy being, this immovable object. If Gaster is involved somehow, again, kind of going to the Vice theory, it's the whole thing of, like, well, yeah, you have these big unmoving things, but there are outside actors messing with variables just to see what happens.
In short, if the soul is merely the player, then this exploration of oppressive systems weakens because the player is not meaningfully constrained. But if the soul is a third entity, subject to the same larger structures as Chris, then their conflict becomes thematically consistent with the rest of Deltarune. And those are just the thematic reasons for believing in third entity theory. Once we talk about the actual structure of the narrative, it leans even further away from player soul theory. The idea of a game about the player and the protagonist being at odds with one another is undeniably fascinating. I really think that such a game would be super cool and would offer a fresh perspective on our relationship with video games. However, despite how cool it would be, Deltarune's narrative structure does not lend itself to a story about such a dynamic. You see, in the majority of fiction, if a story is primarily about a relationship, then that relationship is usually dramatized. It is framed as the central focus. It is foregrounded. And in order to make the audience feel invested, that relationship is given texture, reciprocity, and escalation. The audience is allowed to see friction from both sides of the dynamic as we watch their story and relationship unfold, which raises the question, is that how Deltarune handles the relationship between Chris and the soul? The answer, quite emphatically, is no. We may understand our side of the dynamic, but Chris is almost completely opaque. They don't narrate their thoughts, they don't directly address the soul, they don't articulate fear, anger, or resentment in any consistent manner, they don't even acknowledge the player as an entity in dialogue. In fact, they don't have dialogue at all. They are a silent protagonist. As a result, any interpretation of their feelings towards the soul has to be inferred from brief, wordless actions, such as removing the soul, locking it in a cage, or looking at the camera. Those moments are certainly striking, but they're also extremely sparse, and the information they convey about Chris and the soul's relationship is inherently vague and limited.
Okay, but at the same time, like, are you just going to ignore all the times where, again, you're kind of ignoring the fact that, Chris is very much, our, lens into the world. It's very obvious that like, unlike with Undertale, like, Chris is the narrator for, all the stuff that, and actions we do. The first one that comes to mind is that whole bit in Chapter 2, where you leave the room after Queen put you in there, and you come across Asriel's room, and you go to look in the room, and Chris specifically goes out of their way to not describe what's in the room. Or that time in the church where you go to the back closet and you go to look inside to open the door, and Chris specifically does not open the door even though you tell them to. There are a number of times where Chris specifically goes against your own wishes, and I can completely understand why they wouldn't make a very big deal out of it, because they're already known as the weird kid in school. Nobody else knows that they're being controlled by us, an extra-dimensional video game, an extra-dimensional gamer from, across time and space, because otherwise they'd go from being the weird kid to the kid that was sent to an insane asylum.
On a structural level, the game does not build scenes around an ever-evolving player-Chris relationship. Instead, it has Chris and the Soul doing their own separate things, with them barely ever acknowledging one another, with the sole exception of when they get in each other's way. The idea that this game is heavily focused on exploring the dynamic between player and protagonist becomes even more dubious once you look at the way Deltarune handles other dramatic relationships. Noelle and Queen's coercive dynamic is repeatedly foregrounded, verbalized, and escalated, allowing us deep insight into their quasi-mother-daughter relationship. Susie's dynamic with the old man is given countless pieces of dialogue and cutscenes in order to flesh out their teacher-student relationship, while simultaneously granting the audience a deeper understanding of the philosophies and worldviews of both characters. Rousseau's unhealthy relationship with the Lightners and the way it results in him refusing to self-actualize himself is the central backbone of his character, and the core source of conflict between him and Susie. And once again, we know this because we are given cutscene after cutscene after cutscene fleshing out their relationship with each other and with their circumstances, all while using explicit thematic language to add depth and clarity to their story. The point I'm trying to make is that when Deltarune wants to foreground a dynamic, it does so clearly, repeatedly, and explicitly in order to ensure that the audience grasps the nature of the dynamic and how that relationship is evolving. By contrast, the Chris-Soul relationship is structurally backgrounded. It is most notable for how little attention it gets. It appears in punctuated moments for dramatic effect, but at no point is the relationship between the Soul and Chris ever the central narrative focus. If the core thesis of the game were primarily about player versus protagonist and about exploring that relationship in depth, you would expect more reciprocal acknowledgement, more explicit discussion of their differences, more framing that centers their opposing goals and the tension that results, and most importantly of all, you would expect some degree of interior access to Chris's perspective.
But again, we do. Just that little bit. Again, the whole thing that Chris is the quote-unquote narrator for how we, experience the world through, descriptions and stuff like that. And again, it's the whole idea that, unlike with literally every other one of those, interactions and character pairs, the Soul, and i.e. us, and Chris is a secret to the rest of the world. While Susie knows about the Soul because it appears during battle, she doesn't know that it's a completely separate entity. And again, there's the whole thing that Chris is, doing stuff behind the scenes without us even knowing ourselves. There's purposely keeping things secret. So they're purposely going out of their way to not draw attention to themselves.
But instead, the narrative consistently redirects our attention outwards, towards systems, towards prophecy, towards other characters and their struggles with constraint. The Chris versus Soul dynamic feels less like the main dramatic engine and more like a structural device that primarily exists to allow us to view everyone else's stories, something that reinforces the broader theme without ever being fleshed out itself. Now, that doesn't mean this relationship is unimportant, but importance is not the same as centrality. Deltarune's narrative architecture distributes its thematic weight across multiple constrained relationships and systemic pressures. It does not concentrate the majority of its dramatic emphasis on a sustained player versus protagonist duel. And in storytelling, what is repeatedly staged, verbalized, and elaborated upon tends to indicate the primary focus. The stuff that is withheld and kept opaque often functions as atmosphere, mystery, or structural tension, but it does not function as the main conflict. In short, the extreme opacity of Chris and the lack of narrative focus on the relationship between Chris and the soul makes it seem rather unlikely that Deltarune is primarily interested in exploring the relationship between the player and the protagonist. The game simply does not allocate enough narrative real estate to that relationship for it to convincingly function as the central dramatic axis. To put it another way, if the Chris-Soul dynamic really is the game's core conflict, then why do we know so little about Chris? We are 4 chapters deep into a game that is only going to be 7 chapters long, and yet we still don't know almost anything about our protagonist, and we definitely don't know how they feel about us.
No, I'm fairly certain we can, just from the all of this, I'm fairly certain we can kind of connect the dots here and kind of figure out how Chris feels exactly about us. They don't want us.
Do they hate us, fear us, like us, dislike us? Do they view us as a pest to be eliminated, or as a necessary evil for accomplishing their goals? Do they think we're a ghost, or a demon, or an alien, or a god? Do they look down on us, or view us as lesser than them? How do they feel about us controlling them in day-to-day operations? We know they dislike some of our decisions, but what about choosing to flirt with enemies, or dress up like a nurse? Do they like that? Dislike that? How do they feel about us choosing to spare and recruit enemies to the hometown? Would they prefer if we used violence? Do they care about Darkners at all? Do they enjoy being made to eat moss? Do they think this Birdley statue is the coolest thing ever? I could go on, because there is so much that we don't know, but you get the point. If you were a game designer and you wanted to explore the relationship between the player and the protagonist, then wouldn't it make more sense to have an open line of communication between us? Wouldn't it make more sense to have our protagonist reacting in such a way that we can clearly see how our choices make them feel? And we know that Chris could talk to us if they wanted to. They aren't mute, yet they still refuse to communicate with us in any way. Why would you write them this way if your main goal was to explore the impact that controlling a protagonist has on their psyche?
Because, okay, I've lost count of how many times I've said it in this video, but like one of the main things is seemingly the nature of our control. Our controls are imperfect. I don't know what you'd actually let me look up. What is the standard resolution of Deltarune? Yeah, I'm just gonna go with like the standard answer here. We're basically viewing the Deltarune world through a 640 by 480 pixel window. Our resolution into this world is not, by any stretch of the imagination, high definition, and our controls to manipulate Chris and, to communicate with Chris in such a way are just as limited and crude. Again, it's one of those things you have to remember, that that kind of changes when you actually start the game proper, but when you first start the game, remember, you have those, very dark, you have those, green squares look like old monochrome computer displays and stuff like that. Whatever technology we're using, whatever the device is, or whatever the thing is that we're using to actually control it, whether we're using like an Atari-style joystick with a single button on top or whatever, we are not using the most high-tech equipment to do this. The whole thing is oh yeah, you could have this whole thing where we have this whole deep connection with Chris, but our apparatus to do so is so limited that it's at most we can move in the 4 cardinal directions and say, look at that.
In short, when analyzing Deltarune's narrative structure, it does not incline me to believe that the relationship between Chris and the player is the core focus. Deltarune is over halfway done, and we still know almost nothing about Chris, and even less about the relationship between Chris and the soul. That does not make sense if the player-protagonist conflict is the central dynamic that Deltarune is designed to explore, which is why I think it is much more likely that Chris and the soul are just meant to be yet another story of constrained freedom in a world full of constrained freedom. They may play an important part, but they are still just one thread in a larger tapestry, and their role, for the most part, is simply to allow us the ability to observe that tapestry. To put it simply, I do not think that this game is about us. With all that said, we can now discuss the third and final category of evidence that leads me to believe in third entity theory: authorial patterns. Or I guess it would be more accurate to say authorial pattern singular, as there's really only one pattern that I wish to discuss. To put it simply, player soul theory depends on the soul functioning as a player's stand-in. It is not its own entity or character, and is instead meant to be nothing more than our representative in this world. However, Toby Fox has demonstrated a consistent pattern of subverting the concept of player stand-ins. Throughout both Undertale and Deltarune, every time a character or entity was framed as being nothing more than our avatar in the game world, it was later revealed that they were actually their own people. This pattern began with the fallen human, aka Kara. At the start of Undertale, we are shown a flashback of Kara falling into the underground, after which we are prompted to give them a name. That name then appears in our stat menu and in our save files, suggesting that this fallen human is our faceless player stand-in. However, this is a trick. In reality, Kara was their own person, with their own history, personality, and relationships that all began and ended long before the player booted up the game. After we realize that we are not playing as the fallen human, we move on to assuming that this character is our actual player stand-in, as we have been controlling them for the entire game. However, this too is a trick. At the end of the True Pacifist route, it is revealed that the human we've been controlling is named Frisk, and Flowey explicitly makes it clear that Frisk is not the player when they beg us to let Frisk live their life. We then move on to Deltarune, where we are immediately prompted to create a vessel. We are then walked through what is effectively a character creation sequence, with this vessel being framed as the most explicit example of a player stand-in that we've seen thus far. However, as you likely guessed, this is also a trick. Before we even finish creating this vessel, the narrator drops quite the bombshell when he asks what we think of our creation, and he then promises that it will not hear. This line reveals that even though the vessel has only just been created, it already has its own identity and interiority independent from us, to the point that our remarks could potentially hurt its feelings. This poor vessel is then abandoned, and we are dumped into Chris, the adopted human child of Toriel. Given that the most popular ending of Undertale has Frisk being adopted by Toriel, it is not unreasonable for someone to assume that this is a spiritual continuation of that story.
Oh god, that part, yeah, I can definitely get behind. I think that's basically what everybody's thought on Deltarune was when the first chapter was initially released. I mean, actually, going back, I think with my video, I think I literally called the first episode Undertale 2 with a question mark. Never mind. I didn't call it Undertale 2. I called it the Undertale AU.
As a result, you can very easily find yourself identifying with Chris. However, right out the gate, there's already quite a bit of evidence to suggest that Chris is their own person, as not only do they have their own unique name, history, and pre-existing relationships, but when we get to the first save file, it already has Chris's name on it. This will fill anyone with suspicion about Chris's role as a player stand-in, and any doubt that may remain is fully dashed when Chris removes their soul at the end of Chapter 1, proving that they are, in fact, their own person. For those of you who are keeping...
But again, that is one of those theories that it's... not theories, one of those themes that's been kind of going, especially with early Deltarune, was that it was the whole thing, especially... and actually going also back to Undertale a little bit. It's that whole thing of the player automatically thinking that they are the character. I mean, there's that whole thing that's like, if you name yourself and your avatar the same thing in the character creation, Gaster is like, of course they would share the same name, because you know, that's what you would do. It's like the beginning of Deltarune specifically like expects you to believe that you are the character and that you're not controlling a quote-unquote living being.
Count, that makes Chris the second entity in Deltarune and the fourth entity in this series to be presented as a stand-in for the player, only to then have it revealed that they are actually their own independent people. This, understandably, makes me highly suspicious of player soul theory, as that school of thought relies quite heavily on the idea that the soul is meant to be yet another player stand-in. And call me a pessimist if you must, but if the first 4 times weren't true player stand-ins, then I really don't think the 5th time is going to be any different. In short, given Toby Fox's authorial pattern of never giving us a true player stand-in, I am very much inclined to believe that this soul is no different, and that we are actually controlling a third diegetic entity who simply resides inside this soul. Or to put it another way, Occam's razor posits that the explanation that relies on the fewest assumptions is more likely to be true, and concluding that a heavily ingrained pattern will continue to hold true requires fewer assumptions than concluding such a pattern will suddenly stop.
That is, if you are just ignoring certain patterns on top of that as well.
And those are the reasons I am a proponent of third entity theory. To summarize, we have textual evidence suggesting a pre-existing possession, we have characterization that distinguishes the soul from both Chris and the player, we have a core theme that is better serviced by Chris and the soul being equally constrained, we have a narrative structure that does not foreground a player-Chris relationship as the central focus, and we have a long-running authorial pattern of undermining the concept of player stand-ins. Of course, none of this proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that third entity theory is true, as the game ultimately isn't finished yet. But taken together, this evidence does form a coherent pattern, one that third entity theory explains cleanly and consistently, while the opposition, in my opinion, does not. That is why I think third entity theory has a higher probability of being correct. And that's about it. If you were confused about my opposition to player soul theory, then I hope this clarified where I'm coming from. And to be clear, the purpose of this video was not to convert people to third entity theory. The point was simply to explain why I believe in this theory, and also to show that my position is not rooted in personal preferences, but rather in the story, themes, and evidence presented within Deltarune. with all that said, normally this would be the part of the video where I talk about how you can subscribe to my Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and that will get you access to my videos a week before they're released on YouTube. However, this particular topic, third entity theory, is a bit of a lightning rod right now, and so I think I'm actually going to keep this one on Patreon at least for a little bit longer. The reason I bring it up is to say, hey, if you subscribe for as little as $1, you can get access to a video that the folks on YouTube may not get to see for a whole month. Huzzah! But yeah, I hope y'all are all doing okay. It's a bit of a weird time out there in the real world, so I hope my content can help distract you from that, at least for a little while. And of course, I am incredibly grateful to all of my patrons for their continued support. Y'all really do help me during these difficult financial times.
Oh, God. Again, I mean, like, no hard feelings to Jaru. At the end of the day, it's literally just theorizing about a video game. It's not like it's hurting anybody. And at the end, like, I get... Jaru does have, at least a little bit of history of being, partially correct. I mean, again, there was the whole thing. Oberon Smog was at least partially correct on, like, 1 or 2 accounts. At least specifically towards, like, the fact that there was a, for lack of a better word, Dustner of Gerson. So who knows? Maybe that pattern will continue, and there's going to be, and like both sides are technically wrong when it comes to the player. Like it's neither third entity nor a player insert. Like it's Toby Fox. Anything's possible, really. But at the end of the day, it's the whole thing with this. It's like there are just so many things that just seemingly were ignored. That like Jaru didn't even pay lip service to or anything. Hey, I mean, we're going to have to see, won't we? But yeah, that is definitely going to be it for now. So yeah, I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye. And last but not least, a very special thank you to my YouTube and Patreon supporters. Honestly, I am extremely thankful to anybody that thinks I'm worth it.